In the previous clip, you used the element name property of the binding markup extension to define another element as a data source. Beside the element name property, there are other ways to define a data source. You can also use the source property of the binding markup extension. In XAML, you can use the source property with a static resource markup extension to use a resource as a data source. You will learn more about the static resource markup extension later in this course. Another option to set a data source is the binding's relative source property. It allows you to bind to another element in the XAML document relatively, like for example directly to the element on which you create the data binding. For example here, you can bind the height property of this rectangle to its own width property. This means that this rectangle will be a square even when you change its width property. Note that the relative source property of the binding markup extension is set by using another markup extension that has in this case the name relative source. So as you can see, you can use other markup extensions like static resource and relative source inside of the binding markup extension. Now, beside these three properties, the binding markup extension has one additional option to define a data source, and that is the data context. If you neither set element name nor source nor relative source, like on this binding, then the binding markup extension uses the data context. Let me show you now what that means. Let's say that this text block is in a stack panel and the stack panel is in a grid. Every element in WPF has a data context property that is of type object. This property is defined in the framework element class, which is a base class for all controls and panels. Let's set here the data context property on the grid to the string plural side. The binding markup extension will look in this case into the data context property of the text block. As it is not set, it goes one level up in the element tree and it looks into the data context property of the stack panel. That property is also not set, so it goes again one level up and looks into the data context property of the grid element. There it finds the string plural side and it uses that string as a data source. As a result, the text property of the text block is set to the string plural side. When you set the data context property on the stack panel to the string Thomas, the binding markup extension will use the string Thomas for the text property of the text block. This is because the data context property of the stack panel is the first data context that is set. Now instead of using a simple string as a data context, like in this code snippet, you can also put a more complex object into the data context. Then you can bind to the properties of that object. Exactly this is what the model view viewModel pattern does. So let's take a look at that pattern.